Ladies and gentlemen, fight fans all around the world, let's talk some boxing. I want to give all thanks to my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Without him, I would not be here today to talk to you. If you don't know who Jesus is, just ask him. Say, Lord Jesus, I want to know who you are in my life. It'll be the beginning of something you'll never forget and regret. Alright, let's get into this. Floyd Mayweather TBE, more evidence that he is the best ever. Now, Floyd Mayweather claims he's fought and beat more world champions than anybody else in the sport of boxing, in boxing history, period. And as you can see here, he has a record of 24-0 against former or current world titleists. They call them world champions, okay? And there are 22 of them, okay? Now, a lot of people say, well, today it's easy to become a world champion because they got 4 different sanctioning bodies. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm only going to look at the WBC and WBA, because the WBC and WBA has been around since 1921, and those are the boxing bodies that the greats post 1921 actually had. Those were the titles they had. When you saw them say that they were undisputed world champions, they actually held both belts, or sometimes you would see one of the belts. Now, the WBC was formerly known as the NYSAC, or New York State Athletic Commission, and the WBA was formerly known as the NBA, or National Boxing Association. It went worldwide, both associations, even though the New York State Athletic Commission is still around, and now they are known as World Boxing Council and World Boxing Association. So those are the 2 belts. They've been around forever, and you can't have 2 champions having both of those, 2 world champions having both of those belts. You either have one world champion having the WBA, one world champion having the WBC. So that argument that because there are more belts, there are more world champions, don't fly here. You can only have a champion with 1 belt at a time in history. Alright, so let's go into it. So how many world champions Floyd Mayweather faced who had either the WBA or WBC belt? So let's look. Let's start off with Genaro Hernandez. So Genaro Hernandez, he was the WBA featherweight champion, and he was also the WBC featherweight champion. He had both belts. That's one world champion that had both the WBA and WBC belts. And also, he is in the World Boxing Hall of Fame. And for those of you who don't know, there's the International Boxing Hall of Fame, and there's the World Boxing Hall of Fame, which is less known as the International Boxing Hall of Fame. There are 2 Hall of Fames for boxing. Okay, so he is a World Boxing Hall of Fame inductee. He's not in the International Boxing Hall of Fame. He's not inducted into that as yet, but he will be eventually inducted into that because he is one of the longest reigning super featherweight champions in the history of boxing, and undefeated until he faced Floyd Mayweather at super featherweight. Let's look at the other champion he faced, Gregorio Vargas. And Gregorio Vargas was the WBC featherweight champion, so that's 2 world champions. Alright, let's look at the 3rd world champion, which is Diego Corrales. And Diego Corrales, he had the WBC lightweight champion, so he was a WBC champion, so that makes it 3. Okay. We now look at Carlos Hernandez. Carlos Hernandez is an IBF super featherweight champion, so we won't count Carlos Hernandez. Then we have Jesus Chavez, which is probably number 4 because he was the WBC super featherweight champion after he faced Floyd Mayweather. And so Jesus Chavez makes number 4. Jose Luis Castillo was already, we know this, he was a lightweight world champion WBC. That's number 5. And then we have DeMarcus Corley. He was a WBO champion. He wasn't the WBA or WBC. Arturo Gatti, he was the WBC Super Lightweight World Champion. That makes number 6. Sean Bay Mitchell, he was the WBA Light Welterweight World Champion. That's number 7. Zav Judah, we already know Zav Judah was the WBC Welterweight World Champion. You see it there. He's also the WBA. He was the undisputed welterweight world champion. He was the last undisputed welterweight world champion, actually. He had the WBC, WBA, and IBF belts. So he's number 8. Carlos Baldomir was the WBC welterweight world champion. That's number 9. Oscar De La Hoya, when Floyd faced him, was the WBA super welterweight world champion. He was also a prominent WBC light welterweight and welterweight world champion when he beat Pernell Whitaker. So he was a long reigning WBC and WBA world champion. That's number 9. Ricky Hatton, who is the welterweight WBA world champion. People don't know this. He wasn't just a light welterweight world champion, but he was also a WBA welterweight world champion and WBA light welterweight world champion when he beat Carlos Malsa, who had beaten that Guyanese fighter. I just can't remember what his name is right now. So that's number 10. Juan Manuel Marquez. Juan Manuel Marquez was a WBA featherweight world champion, WBA super featherweight world champion, WBA lightweight world champion. So he's number 11. Sugar Shane Mosley. Sugar Shane Mosley was the WBC welterweight world champion, WBA welterweight world champion, WBA light middleweight world champion, and WBC light middleweight world champion. So he feasted on the WBC and WBA. That's number 12. These weren't world champions while Floyd Mayweather was a world champion. This is very important for you to understand. Then you have Victor Ortiz. And Victor Ortiz was the WBC welterweight world champion. Floyd wasn't the world champion at the time. That's number 13, I believe. Miga Cotto. Miga Cotto was the WBA welterweight world champion. He was the WBA light middleweight world champion. He was the WBC middleweight world champion. That's number 14. Robert Guerrero. Robert Guerrero was an IBF world champion, so forget about him. Saul Canelo Alvarez. Well, Saul Canelo Alvarez was the WBC light middleweight world champion, WBA light middleweight world champion, WBC middleweight world champion. He's currently the WBO light middleweight world champion, so he's number 15. Marcos El Chino Maidana. He was the WBA light welterweight world champion and the WBA welterweight world champion. That's number 16. Manny Pacquiao. Manny Pacquiao was the WBC flyweight world champion, WBC super featherweight world champion, WBC lightweight world champion, WBC light middleweight world champion. So that makes it number 17. Alright. And then we have Andre Berto. And Andre Berto was the WBC welterweight world champion, the IBF welterweight world champion. That's number 18. So Floyd Mayweather had 18 WBC, WBA world champions that he beat. And these guys weren't world champions while he was a world champion with the WBC or WBA in that weight class. So you only have one world champion at a time, right? So you can't be talking about, oh, they were multiple world champions in the weight class he was in. Nope, it wasn't like that. I mean, Marcus Maidana was the WBA world champion while Floyd was the WBC world champion. That is true. But for the most part, even back in the day, sometimes guys were the NBA world champion and the other guy had the NYSAC world championship and he had the IBU world championship. He had actually 3 world championships back in the day, but the IBU was mostly in Europe. So, and all of those were recognized world championships. You were called the undisputed world champion when you had the NYSAC and the NBA, right? You get those two together. So at the end of the day, though, generally speaking, the Undisputed World Championship didn't break up because in that politics like today, for the most part, the same number of world champions back in the day would have been the same number of WBA, WBC world champions you'd have today. It's just what it is. So when Floyd says he beat 18 world champions, Sugar Ray Robinson, I think he beat like 14, and I think Henry Armstrong beat 16. Floyd really has beaten more world champions than all the other boxers in history. And it's valid if you think of it in terms of the WBC, WBA, and it's even valid if you think of it in terms of the other belts, which are really derivatives of the WBA, which would be the IBF and the WBO. And no matter how you try to look at it, whether you look at it in WBC, WBA, he still has the most. If you look at it in terms of the other additional belts, he still has the most, and that's the thing. He makes history that way, either way how you look at it. All right, and Floyd has beaten a number of lineal world champions as well. All right, a number of lineal world champions. This is all very important. He beat Gennaro Hernandez, as you can see here. He beat Diego Corrales, Jose Luis Castillo, Zab Judah, Carlos Baldomir, Oscar De La Hoya, Ricky Hatton, Juan Manuel Marquez, Shane Mosley, Miguel Cotto, and Manny Pacquiao. He's beaten more lineal world champions than, I believe, any other fighter in history. And his total is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I think it's 12 actually, but I'm not quite sure which one we left out in that mix. So he's beaten 11 lineal world champions. Nobody else in the history of boxing has done that. So these are all records that you have to pay attention to. Okay? And his Hall of Famers and Hall of Fame inductees are going to change as time goes along. You know, there's the International Boxing Hall of Fame like we saw, Arturo Gatti and Oscar De La Hoya in that one. But you also have Gennaro Hernandez, who's inducted into the World Boxing Hall of Fame, which is another boxing Hall of Fame. You have to think about all these different things, right? So on that note, I hope you guys realize that Floyd Mayweather's TBE and his claim that he beat more world champions than anybody else is actually valid. You go do your homework, do your research into this, you'll see it's valid. Whether you think that you should exclude the WBO and IBF belts, he still beats more world champions than the other guys, or that he had all 4 belts. It's still a fact. Okay. The other thing is, a lot of people like to say, well, back in the day it was hard to become a world champion because you never got the shot at the world championship, right? Even if you say that, when we look at the amount of known, really good fighters, very good fighters of any era, Floyd has beaten just about the same amount as Sugar Ray Robinson. Sugar Ray Robinson it's Sugar Ray Robinson, Roy Jones Jr., and Harry Kreb have faced the most amount of really notable great names. Okay, they faced the most, but beating the most amount, Sugar Ray Robinson matches Floyd Mayweather with that, and Roy Jones Jr. and Harry Kreb have one less. Okay, and I did a video on this, and even in that respect, Floyd Mayweather, when you look at all of the notable names Floyd Mayweather met in his era, he beat. You can't say that for Sugar Ray Robinson. You can't say that for Harry Kreb. You can't say that for Roy Jones Jr. You see what I'm saying? Even though they may have faced more. So at the end of the day, no matter how you try to shake it, dice it, or look at it, Floyd Mayweather Jr. is the best ever when it comes to competition and world champions and notable fighters. He is the best ever. You can slice it, dice it, however you want to look at it. These are just facts. These are just facts. This has nothing to do with my opinion, my happiness, my fandom, none of that. These are just facts. You just have to accept them as they are. On that note, you guys have a great one.